I've been a nurse for 6 years, and I can tell you exactly what it feels like to watch someone's vitals drop and know there's nothing more you can do. What I never expected was to be the one lying in that bed, staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize, wondering why the room was so quiet. My name is Claire. I'm 28 years old, and for the last 5 years, I was my family's Plan B, Plan J, and Plan D, all rolled into one person who never learned to say no. Let me back up. My mother has 2 children. There's me. And then there's my brother, Dylan. Dylan is 24, charming, and has never held a job for longer than 4 months. He surfs. He takes photography courses he never finishes. He once told my mother he was exploring his creative identity, and she looked at him the way people look at sunsets, like something beautiful was happening right in front of them, and they didn't want to blink. I became a registered nurse at 22. I worked nights. I worked doubles. I worked holidays. I sent money home because my mother would call and say the electricity bill was late. Or Dylan needed new equipment for whatever phase he was in that month. Or my stepfather's truck needed repairs, and they were just a little short. A little short. That phrase lived in my phone like a recurring alarm. Every few weeks, a little short, my stepfather, Ron. I married my mother when I was 11. He's not a bad man. He's just a man who always had a reason why things weren't quite working out. The business idea that almost happened, the investment that would have paid off if the timing had been different. He and Dylan understood each other in a way that quietly excluded me. And my mother stood at the center of it all, holding the whole fragile thing together with my money and her blind spots. I didn't see it clearly for a long time. When you grow up being the responsible one, you start to think that's just who you are. You think you're helping. You think that's what love looks like. It takes something really dramatic to make you understand the difference between love and obligation, between choosing someone and simply being chosen because you'll say yes. For me, that something was a Tuesday in October. I had picked up a 3rd shift that week because one of my colleagues had a family emergency, and I didn't want to leave the floor short-staffed. I had worked 31 hours over 2 days. Gone home. Slept for 5 hours. And gone back in. I remember standing at the medication cart around 2 in the morning and thinking that the fluorescent lights seemed very far away. I thought I was just tired. I told myself to get through the next 4 hours. I made it to 4:15 before my legs stopped cooperating. One of my colleagues found me on the floor near the supply closet. I don't remember falling. The next thing I was aware of was a different ceiling. Softer lights. And a blood pressure cuff squeezing my arm. Someone was saying my name in a tone that nurses use when they don't want to frighten a patient. I had used that tone myself hundreds of times. Hearing it aimed at me was one of the stranger experiences of my life. The doctor who came in told me I had collapsed from severe exhaustion and dehydration, that my blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, and that they were admitting me for monitoring and IV fluids. He had the kind of calm face that means the news could be worse. But it's still not good. I asked him how long. He said probably 4 or 5 days. Maybe longer, depending on how my body responded. I lay there for a while after he left. Then I picked up my phone and called my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her what happened. I kept my voice steady. I explained where I was, what the doctors had said, and that I was going to be okay. But I was in the hospital for at least several days. There was a pause on her end. Then she said, and I want to be precise here, because I have replayed this moment many times. Claire, that's terrible. You need to take better care of yourself. I said. Mom, I'm in the hospital. She said. I know. Sweetheart, listen. Can I call you back in about an hour? We're in the middle of packing. I asked her what she meant by packing. She told me that Ron and Dylan were flying out the next morning. Dylan had gotten into a surf competition in Jacksonville, Florida, and she and Ron were going to watch him compete and make a week of it. She said they'd had the trip planned for 2 months. She said Jacksonville was only a 4-hour flight. She got the geography wrong. It's a 3-hour drive from where we live, and not a flight. And that she would check in on me every day. I said, "Mom? I just told you I'm in the hospital." She said, "Claire, but you said yourself you're going to be okay. And Dylan has been working so hard for this." Dylan had been working so hard. Dylan, who had never worked a double shift in his life. Dylan, whose competition entry fee I had transferred 2 weeks earlier when my mother said they were a little short. I didn't say any of that. I said, "Okay. I have a good trip. Talk soon." And I hung up. My roommate at the hospital, a woman named Patty, who had broken her hip and had the world's most reliable opinions about everything, looked over at me and said, "Honey, was that your family?" I said yes. She said, "Are they coming?" I said no. She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Well, that tells you something." It did. I just wasn't ready to look at it yet. The first 2 days were quiet, in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood. No shifts to pick up. No phone calls asking if I could cover, or asking if I could send, or asking if I remembered to do the thing I'd promised. My colleagues came by on their breaks and brought me terrible cafeteria, soup, and better gossip. And the nurses taking care of me were kind, in the particular way that healthcare workers are kind to each other, a little extra thorough, a little less clinical. My mother texted on day 2. Dylan placed second in his heat. She sent a photo of him on the beach, holding a small trophy. He was grinning. I looked at the photo for a long time. I recognized his wetsuit. I had bought it on day 3. One of the nurses mentioned during evening rounds that I'd had a visitor while I was sleeping that afternoon. She described a man, older, well-dressed, who had sat quietly for about 40 minutes and left without waking me. She said he'd signed the visitor log at the front desk. She said he seemed to know me, but she wasn't sure how because he hadn't said much. He'd just asked if I was doing better, and when she said yes, he'd nodded like he already knew, and sat down. I didn't know who she was describing. I asked her what name he'd signed. She said she'd have to check, and I told her not to worry about it. I thought it was probably a colleague I hadn't placed from her description. Maybe someone from another floor. I forgot about it within the hour. He came back the next night. I was awake that time. It was late. After 9. And the ward had gone into that particular nighttime stillness that I knew so well from the other side of it. The door opened softly, and a man I didn't immediately recognize came in and sat down in the chair beside my bed with the quiet ease of someone who had been there before. He was maybe 60, with gray at his temples and a jacket that looked like it had been folded into a bag and then carefully smoothed. He looked at me like he was checking something against a memory. I said, "I'm sorry. I don't think I know you." He said, "You probably don't." "Not really. My name is Thomas Ward. I knew your father. I grew up without a father. Or, more accurately, I grew up with a mother who answered questions about my father with one-word answers that were clearly designed to end conversations. His name was David. He left when I was 2. End of story. I had learned by the time I was 7 that pushing further made my mother go somewhere unreachable for the rest of the day. So I stopped pushing. I told Thomas Ward that I didn't know much about my father. He nodded slowly and said he was aware of that. He said he and my father had been close friends. The way people are close when they go through something hard together. He said my father had asked him, a long time ago, to keep an eye on me. He said he had done that from a distance for years, which he knew probably sounded strange. And he wasn't trying to frighten me or complicate my life. He said he had heard I was in the hospital through someone who worked in the building, and he had come because he wanted to make sure I was all right. I asked him why my father hadn't kept that eye on me himself. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father had passed away 3 years ago. A heart condition." He said he had debated whether to reach out to me then, but I had seemed to be doing well on my own, and he hadn't wanted to disrupt what I'd built. I don't know what I expected to feel in that moment. What I actually felt was very tired and sad in a way that was different from the exhaustion of the past few days. It was the kind of sad that has been waiting a long time to be felt. Thomas didn't try to fill the silence. He just sat there. I realized later, one of the things that distinguished him from almost everyone else in my life. He didn't need me to be okay so that he could be comfortable. He came back the next evening, and the one after that, we talked about small things first. The hospital food, the view from my window. He told me he was retired, that he had spent his career in civil engineering, that he lived about 20 minutes from the hospital and had lived in the area for 15 years. He told me he'd been married once, happily, and that his wife had passed 6 years ago, and that since then he kept himself busy with a woodworking hobby and a garden that was, in his words, more ambitious than my knees prefer. Slowly, over those evenings, I started to understand who my father had been. Not the absence. The person. Thomas described him as someone who was good at listening, bad at conflict, and deeply remorseful about the choices he'd made when he was young, including leaving. Thomas was careful with how he said it. He wasn't excusing my father. He was just giving me a picture of someone who had been real and flawed and full of regret. And I found that I needed that more than I had known. On the 6th day, my mother came back. I knew she was coming because she texted from the airport. She said Dylan had done great overall, that the trip had been wonderful, and that she was coming straight from the airport to see me. There was an energy in the texts that I recognized, the kind of energy that wants credit for showing up, that arrives loudly to offset the fact that it was absent. She walked in with Ron behind her, and the first thing she did was hug me and say I looked pale. Then she looked around the room and said it wasn't as bad as she'd imagined. Then she pulled up a chair and started telling me about Jacksonville. I let her talk. I was watching her in a way I hadn't before, the way you watch something when you've had a week of unusual quiet and your eyes have adjusted. After about 15 minutes, she noticed the visitor log sheet the floor nurse had left on my side table, which they'd given me to review as part of an administrative follow-up on my care. It was standard practice. The names of everyone who had visited were listed with dates and times. My mother picked it up. I watched her scan it. Ron leaned over to look. My mother's face changed. The expression wasn't dramatic in the way dramatic expressions are in movies. It was smaller than that. It was a tightening, a kind of rapid internal calculation that surfaced for just a moment before she put the look away. She set down the log. She said, "Who is Thomas Ward?" I said he was someone who knew my father. The room went very still. My mother said, in a careful voice, "Where did you meet him?" I said I hadn't met him before this. He had come to the hospital. He had come every night. Ron cleared his throat and looked at the window. I asked my mother how she knew Thomas Ward's name. She said she didn't. She was just asking. But her face had already told a different version of that story. Later, after they left, my mother had cut the visit shorter than I think she intended. Something about being tired from the travel. I called Thomas. I told him my mother had seen his name on the visitor log. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wondered if that might happen someday." I asked him to tell me what she knew about him. He took a breath. And the slow kind. That means what comes next has been carried for a long time. He told me that my mother and my father had not simply drifted apart. He told me that my father had tried to maintain contact with me when I was small, that he had sent letters, that he had called, and that the communication had gradually been cut off in ways that were not accidental. He said he didn't want to speak badly about my mother, that he understood she had been hurt, and that people do things in the aftermath of hurt that they can't always see clearly. But he said, my father had not stopped trying to be present as early as I might have been led to believe. He said Thomas and my father had talked about me often, right up until the end. He said my father had followed my career from a distance. He had known I became a nurse. He had been proud of that. He had kept a photo of me from my nursing school graduation that someone had posted publicly online, and Thomas had seen it on my father's desk the last time he visited him. I didn't say anything for a long time. Thomas said, I'm sorry I waited so long to reach out. I kept telling myself the right moment would come. And then you ended up in the hospital. And I thought, if I don't go now, I'm just going to be another person who didn't show up when it counted. I said, you showed up every night. He said, I know it doesn't make up for the years. I said it didn't need to make up for anything. It just needed to be what it was. I was discharged 2 days later. My body had done what it needed to do with rest and fluids, and the absence of a 30-hour shift. The attending physician told me very firmly that I needed to make some changes to my schedule. I told him I was already working on it. The changes I made were not just to my schedule. I called my mother the week after I got home. I told her that I had spent the last week thinking about a lot of things, and that I wanted to talk openly rather than let things continue the way they had been. I told her that I had transferred money to help her and Ron and Dylan consistently for 5 years, and that I had done it out of love and a sense of obligation. But that the obligation part wasn't something I was willing to carry anymore. My mother said she didn't know what I was talking about. I read her the total from my own records. 5 years of transfers. The number was significant. She said that family helps each other. I said yes. They do. And I said I hoped that in the future, the help would go in more than one direction. But that either way, the automatic transfers were stopping. She said I was being selfish. I had heard that word aimed at me many times over the years. Every time I hadn't been able to help. Every time I said I was too tired. Or too busy. Or I just needed a week without a request. Selfish. I used to feel the word like a small wound. This time I noticed that I didn't feel it the same way. I said, I love you. Mom. But I was in the hospital for 8 days, and you came on day 8. I needed to say this. She hung up. Dylan texted me 3 days later asking if I could help him with a new lens for his camera. I didn't respond. Ron sent a long message about how family needs to stick together. Especially now. And how I was hurting my mother. I read it. Put my phone face down. And went for a walk. I still see Thomas. We have dinner most Sundays now, at a diner about halfway between our places. He tells me about his garden. I tell him about my patients, nothing identifying, just the texture of the days. The things that are hard, and the things that are unexpectedly funny. He listens the way someone listens when they have time, and the inclination to actually hear you. He brought me something a few weeks ago. A small wooden box. Made well. With clean joints and a smooth finish. He said he had made it in his workshop. Inside, there was a folded piece of paper. He said my father had written it during his last few months. When he knew he was running out of time, he had given it to Thomas and said, if you ever find a way to reach her, give her this. I didn't read it until I got home. I won't share exactly what it said. Because some things are only for the person they're written to. But I'll say this. He knew about the nursing. He knew about the kind of person I'd become. He said he was sorry for the years. And he said he hoped that somewhere in me there was room for the idea that being chosen late was still being chosen. I sat with that for a long time. There's something that happens when you spend years being the person everyone else leans on, carrying things without being asked, and giving without being thanked. You start to forget that you're also allowed to receive. You start to think that need is weakness. that asking is imposition, that the most you can hope for is to be useful to the people around you and quietly fine in the spaces between. The hospital room changed something in me, but not because it was dramatic. It was the quiet of it. 8 nights of someone choosing, without being asked, to come and sit beside me. No request had been made. No favor was owed. Thomas Ward drove 20 minutes through the dark, night after night, for no reason except that a man he had loved like a brother had asked him years ago to look after his daughter. My family went to Florida while I was in the ICU. Thomas Ward came every night. That tells you something, Patty would say. It really does. I'm still a nurse. I still work hard. But I work one shift at a time now. And when I leave the hospital, I leave. I have learned, slowly and with considerable difficulty, that there is a version of love that doesn't empty you. That care given without cost to yourself is more sustainable, more honest, and more real than the kind that runs you into a supply closet floor. I don't know yet what my relationship with my mother will look like long term. I'm not at peace with everything, and I don't think I'm supposed to be yet. But I know that the version of me who transferred money every month without question, who picked up every extra shift so she could send more, who answered every call with yes before she'd even heard the question, that version of me needed to collapse on a hospital floor so that a different version could wake up. And I know that on the nights when the ward is quiet and the city outside the window is dark, I think about a man in a folded jacket sitting beside a bed he had no obligation to sit beside. I think that's what love actually looks like. When you finally see it clearly. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've been the one who always shows up, always covers the bill, always makes it work, I just want you to know something. You don't have to earn your place in the room. You never did. And the people who show up in the dark, without being asked, without needing anything back, hold on to them. They are rarer than you think, and worth more than you've been taught to ask for. Thanks for listening. This is Nice Stories, and I'll see you in the next one.